Thanks. Well, we come to what is probably the most important topic on which we can discuss, and that is the resurrection of Jesus. Excuse me. Thank you. All right, Jesus' resurrection. So let's just look at the facts. Let's bracket faith as much as possible and just look at facts. Now, where I was at back in 2002, Gary Habermas and I were wrapping up, well, we still had some work to do, but we were working to wrapping up our book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And I remember saying to him, Gary, you're the number one expert on this, and you put together a bibliography of more than 2,200 sources at that point, I think it was, of scholars who had written on the resurrection of Jesus since 1975. And by the way, that bibliography has now grown to about 5,500. So I said, you got about 2,200 sources, and you got these scholars, and they're writing on the resurrection, different topics related to it, like the empty tomb, the appearances, things like that. But they look at the same data, and they don't agree with one another. Why is that? And who are these scholars? And he said, well, Mike, they're mostly New Testament scholars, but you will find a few philosophers and only a handful of professional historians. And I thought, well, if this is a historical question, wouldn't a historian be most equipped to be able to address it? And New Testament scholars writing on it, how much training have they actually had in conducting historical investigation? Is it the blind leading the blind? What's going on here? And I thought, this would be a good topic to do a doctoral dissertation on. And so I decided to do that. And in the process, I learned, as I'm studying philosophers of history and professional historians, they say that there's no such thing as the unbiased historian. And I'm thinking, well, wow, that's my problem too then, because I'm biased. But let's do a historical investigation and see what an actual investigation using the tools of the historians, what kind of results would it yield? Apart from just using faith, what would a sober-minded historical investigation yield? So that's what I got involved with. And it took me longer than normal because I just became obsessed with it. And I wanted to conduct it with the utmost integrity, even if it led to a conclusion that with which I wasn't comfortable. And so I'll be honest with you, in graduate school, writing a 20-page single-spaced or double-spaced paper with a few footnotes, it was a nightmare for me, and I'd always put it off till the last minute because I just didn't feel comfortable doing it. It wasn't something I was accustomed to. But my doctoral dissertation ended up being well over 500 pages, single-spaced, with more than 2,000 footnotes. And finally, my supervisor said, Mike, it's time to, let's start wrapping this up. Because it ended up being 3.5 to 4 times longer than the average doctoral dissertation. So I'm just going to share with you in the next few moments, just give you a general idea of how historical investigation works and what it can yield in reference to the resurrection. Let's talk about the practice of history. We have to look at some preliminary issues. And one of those would be the historian's objective. Now, historians, surprisingly, there's a lot on which historians do not agree. And what the historian is even doing and how to define history, there's a lot of disagreement amongst historians on that. But basically, the way I see it is the objective of the historian is to present a historical description. In other words, a hypothesis that provides an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. None of us can get into a time machine and return to the past and then verify and find out what happened. So we're taking educated guesses based on artifacts and reports that have come down to us. That's what the historian is trying to do, and to come up with, a fairly accurate representation of what happened. Doing historical investigation is often like looking through a window into the past. And many times, more times than not, that window is not crystal clear. The window is fuzzy, it's foggy, it's dirty at times. We can see through portions of that window that are clearer than other portions of that window. We can make out some things that are going on the other side of that window, but a lot, again, is still going to be fuzzy and questionable, and we're just, as much as we would like to say, yep, this is what happened, and we can know it with certainty, we have to be honest and say, well, we can believe something and we can use faith, but the tools of the historian only take us so far, and they only justify a certain degree of confidence about the past. And that applies to virtually everything, historically speaking. And of course, the further you go into the past, the fuzzier things can get. Some have described doing history as like putting the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together. The problem is we no longer have the box, and so we don't have a picture of what it's supposed to look like. And to complicate things further is there are pieces from other puzzles that are in there as well, mixed in with those. And so how to make the best sense out of the facts, the data that have come down to us can be a real challenge. The historian's objective is to seek probability, therefore, not proof in an absolute sense. Like I said, we can't go to the past and verify our conclusions, so we are looking for probability, various degrees of probability, and some things are more probable than others. So just speaking about Jesus, we have more evidence that Jesus died by crucifixion than we have that he walked on water or was born of a virgin. That doesn't mean that we should not believe that he walked on water or was born of a virgin. I think the evidence for actually walking on water is one of the best attested miracles we have of Jesus, believe it or not. And we have some pretty good evidence for it. Virgin birth, on the other hand, not nearly as good. Resurrection, a whole lot better. But we're going to be talking about resurrection, and what's really cool, if I had to choose one miracle for which I had like really good evidence for in relation to Jesus, it'd be the resurrection. I'd rather have evidence for the resurrection than for the virgin birth. Christianity could survive if it turned out that the virgin birth was a legend. It couldn't survive if it turned out that the resurrection was, because Jesus based everything about the truth of his claims on his resurrection. All right. Greatest challenge to the historian is the fact that our biases. We all have our own biases based on our race, gender, ethics, nationality, our political, religious, and philosophical convictions, the way we were raised, the academic institutions we attended, and the very group of people whose acceptance and respect we desire. There's no way around this. And so we have these biases, and it's like what historians call these are horizons. It's how we look at the past, how we view things. All of us, it's as though we have a pair of glasses on that are the lenses are tinted. And all of our lenses, your lens is different than your lens, it's different from your lens, different from your lens. But it's through those lenses that we peer into the past, and that's how historians can look at the same data and arrive at radically different conclusions pertaining to what occurred. It's our horizons, the way we see things. Now, a lot of people would say, yeah, you Christians are biased, and so you have these glasses you're looking through. Your horizons are going to motivate and greatly influence your conclusions, and they are correct. But skeptics are going to act as though we're the only ones with biases. But they have biases too, and those biases are just as strong. Dale Allison is one of the foremost, the most elite New Testament scholars in the world today. He teaches at Princeton. He's a great guy too. We don't agree on a number of things, but it's hard to think of a more talented, more gifted New Testament scholar than Dale Allison. He's really amazing. Here's what he says in one of his books. Some we might think of as having no theological agenda are partly motivated by an animus against traditional Christian doctrine, which is in reality just another sort of theological agenda. The trite truth is that none of us is without philosophical bias or theological interest when we sit down to study Christian origins. That's a very honest statement, don't you think? And it's true. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Muslim or a Hindu or a Buddhist, an agnostic, an atheist, a Christian. We all have biases that are going to influence the way we look at things. It's a sober truth, but it's the truth. And it can really compromise the integrity of our investigation. Michael Grant, who was a classicist who wrote on things like Julius Caesar and things like that, he says, the life of Jesus is a theme in which the notorious problem of achieving objectivity reaches its height so that it is impossible to be objective. Now, I was on a radio show, a podcast called Unbelievable several years ago with Justin Brierley. It was Bart Ehrman and I, and we were talking about things such as why we both looked at the evidence and arrived at different conclusions. He ended up leaving Christianity, I ended up staying. And what motivated us, why did we make those decisions? And Bart at one point accused me of being biased, and that's why I still maintain Christianity. And Justin said to him, well, Bart, how about you? Are you biased? And he said, oh, yes, of course I'm biased. We're all biased. It's like, well, I'm sorry, Bart, it kind of hurts, but you can't saw off the branch in which you're sitting. So you accuse me of being biased. Yes, I'm biased, but you're biased too. And if bias disqualifies me, it disqualifies you too. He doesn't seem to grasp that, though, because he's always accusing Christians of being biased, yet at the same time admits that he's biased. Chris Lawrence, he's a professor of the philosophy of history and historiography. Here's what he says. So he's just dealing with regular, non-religious historical issues. And he says, a proper philosophy of history must elucidate the fact that historians present reconstructions of a past reality on the basis of factual research and discuss the adequacy of these reconstructions. At the same time, it must elucidate the fact that these discussions seldom lead to a consensus. That's in non-religious issues. They seldom lead to a consensus, and that therefore pluralism is a basic characteristic of history as a discipline. Isn't that interesting? Even when they're studying non-religious issues, more often than not, there is pluralism. There's no agreement. There's no consensus on what actually happened. So to summarize, all historians have biases. And when it comes to conclusions, a consensus of historians is often absent. And if that is going to be the case with historical conclusions in non-religious matters, then we should certainly expect that there will never be a consensus when it comes to religious matters like what Jesus said and did. That doesn't mean that the evidence is weak. It means that our horizons get in the way and presents a consensus. So what we do as historians and what you can do as non-historians, those of you who aren't in here, is you look at the data and you make your own conclusions based on the data. Now, for now, you can say this knucklehead Licona who's talking, okay, he's a historian. What about the method that he's presenting? What about the things he's saying? Yes, he's biased, but is what he's going to show me on the resurrection of Jesus, does it make the best sense of the evidence? And that's what you've got to decide for yourselves, because there will never be a consensus on this. So I'm going to make this real simple. I'm going to make it so simple that even a Southern Baptist can understand. I used to work for the Southern Baptist, so I can joke like that. I'm going to build a case for the resurrection of Jesus using two major building blocks, facts and method. That's pretty simple. Let's begin with the facts. Now, here we're going to do something called historical bedrock. Now, as I mentioned, there are some facts that are better attested than others. Some facts are so strongly supported by the data that virtually every scholar who studies the subject agrees on it. For example, that Jesus died by crucifixion, or that Jesus taught in parables. Every historian, no matter how skeptical, believes these things. Well, of course, you'll have a few flakes who are way out on the fringe. I know of probably of the hundreds and hundreds of historians who talk about Jesus, you could count the number who are open to the possibility that Jesus survived crucifixion. You can count them all on one hand. That's how little few there are. It's popular amongst college students and some armchair skeptics today to say Jesus didn't exist. They're called mythicists. They think Jesus was a myth. But amongst professional historians, there aren't many. I mean, we're talking about thousands of historians. And fairly recently, Richard Carrier, who is a historian, who is the leading proponent of the Jesus myth theory, he said he knew, including himself, there were seven scholars who think that Jesus did not exist. 7 in the world out of thousands, tens of thousands. That's not very encouraging if that's the view that you hold. Most people laugh at, most historians laugh at those. Bart Ehrman laughs at people who say Jesus never existed. So we're looking at what we can call historical bedrock. These are facts that are so strongly supported by the data that virtually every historian, no matter how skeptical, grants them as facts. Then there are some other facts that are strongly evidenced, but they're not quite as strong, or you don't have the same degree of scholarly acceptance of them. So they work their way up just a little bit here. Not quite as strong, but they're still pretty strong. And then as you keep going up, then you got, well, these have some good evidence for them, but you don't have a lot of scholarly assent for them. And then at the very top, it's like, well, some believe it and some don't. The key here is what I want to say is I want to build my hypothesis, whatever my hypothesis is, I want to build it on the foundation of bedrock. And in fact, if a hypothesis cannot account for the bedrock, then that hypothesis either needs to be revised or trashed. Because these are so strong, everybody accepts them. Now, I'm not saying we should believe something because the consensus of scholars grant it. A consensus has often been mistaken. But I'm saying that when you have Christian, non-Christian, atheist, agnostic, Jews, everybody who are saying, yep, I agree with this, they're looking at the same data, they're all in agreement, even though they have widely different horizons, you're saying, well, the evidence must be quite compelling. I'm pretty safe to acknowledge that as a fact. So for me, one of the things that I'm going to do to minimize my own bias, the impact of my own bias, I'm still going to have a bias, but I'm going to take steps to manage it, to minimize its negative impact. I'm going to require that any hypothesis has to explain the historical bedrock, okay? And I'm going to focus on this. So there's going to be certain facts that are, I believe, are strongly evidenced by the data, but maybe they're not granted by a consensus of scholars. I'm going to say, well, I still believe it, but I could be wrong. And so I'm not going to base my hypothesis on that. I'm going to give really strong preference to the historical bedrock. Now, let's talk about our sources and when they are dated. We've talked about this last night and this morning. Most scholars think Jesus was crucified either in April of 30 or April of 33. It's about 50-50. I kind of prefer 33 for certain reasons, but it really doesn't matter. Let's just say, for the sake of making it a round number, we'll just say it's the year 30 he's crucified. Most scholars also believe that Mark was written between the years 50 and 70, with a large majority in that category, placing it between the years 65 and 70. Could they be wrong? Yeah, we don't know for sure, but this is the best guesses of historians. They also think that Matthew and Luke were written between the years 70 and 85. Now, there are some scholars who would place the Gospels earlier than these. In fact, there's a book written by John A.T. Robinson back in the 1970s. He was a skeptical scholar, And yet he looked and in his book, I think it was called Redating the Gospels, he dated everything in the New Testament to have been written before the year 70. And there's some decent arguments for that. And then just recently, there's a scholar, I think he's Canadian actually, Brenier or something like that. I bought the book, I started reading it, I haven't gotten through it yet. It just came out last year. And he's dating everything before the year 70, all the Gospels, everything. And he's giving some better arguments than what Robinson did. So I'm just telling you where the majority of scholars are today. They could be wrong. It could be that the Gospels were all written before the year 70. Again, I'm just telling you where the majority is today. Matthew and Luke written between 70 and 85, and then John somewhere between 90 to 95. Some scholars are presenting John right before the year 70, and there's a decent argument for it. But again, this is where most scholars are. What I want to do is I want to focus on this period between the crucifixion of Jesus and when the first gospel was written, since this is a very early period. Now, what we have here is we have Paul, the apostle, and there are 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament, 13. And scholars are unanimous that he wrote 7 of them, and of the remaining 6, it's 50-50 regarding 2 of them, and then there are 4 of them that scholars are inclined to think Paul did not write them. Now, I haven't spent a lot of time with that. I would prefer to think that Paul wrote all 13 of them, but I'm just being honest, I haven't looked into the issue. I am convinced that the 2 letters, Colossians and 2 Thessalonians, that 50% say he wrote, I'm convinced that Paul wrote those. I'm also convinced that of the 4 letters, you got 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Ephesians. The majority of scholars do not think Paul wrote those. I think I have looked at Ephesians. I think their arguments are grossly mistaken about Ephesians. I think Paul wrote that. I haven't looked at 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, so it's like I just don't deal with that. I'm just open at that. Again, I'd prefer to think that Paul wrote those, but I haven't studied it. What I want to do for the sake of managing my own bias is I'm only going to consider those letters of Paul that there's a consensus that Paul wrote. So any data that I bring up, it's not going to be something like, yeah, well, maybe Paul didn't write that. No, Paul definitely wrote anything that I'm going to appeal to, okay? Now, Paul, by his own testimony in his undisputed letters, says that he persecuted the church. He was a non-believer, and then he had an experience he interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to him. And that experience radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders, one who ended up being persecuted continuously, his life threatened, and we know from his church history that Paul was martyred. He ended up being beheaded right outside of Rome. Now, Paul, in his letter to the church of Galatia, he says that chapter 1, he says that 3 years after his conversion, he goes up to Jerusalem, 3 years after his conversion. Now, we don't know exactly when he converted, but most scholars would say within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion, more like 1 to 3 years after his crucifixion, but we don't know exactly, can't pinpoint the date. And but 3 years after his conversion, he goes up to Jerusalem, he says, and he met with Peter for 15 days. And he also saw James, the Lord's brother, he says. Now, the Greek word that he uses for meet with Peter, it's hysteresis. Now, what English term do you think we get from that? History. So Paul is saying he went up there to inquire of Peter about the life of Jesus. He wants to get a history. He wants to know what it was like to be with Jesus. He wants to know all the kinds of things that Jesus taught. Now, Paul probably, I think there's a good chance that he saw and heard Jesus during his lifetime because they were in Jerusalem. Paul was a Pharisee, so he would have been in Jerusalem during all the festivals, the Passovers, the same festivals Jesus would have been at. And if Jesus is causing a commotion like overturning the tables in the temple, Paul's going to know about it. If there was that trial before the high priest that Jesus was brought before and condemned by the Sanhedrin, Paul would have known about that. Paul may have even been there. He may have heard Jesus, seen Jesus. He certainly knew some of Jesus' teachings, or else he wouldn't have been out persecuting the church thinking it was a heresy. But he wants more. He wants the whole 9 yards from Jesus. About Jesus from Peter. So he spends 15 days with him. And of course, they're talking about a lot more than just the weather that's going on. So then Paul says in chapter 2 of Galatians, an undisputed letter of Paul. Oh, let me say this. Here's what Bart Ehrman says. Paul was personally acquainted with Jesus' closest disciple, Peter, and Jesus' own brother, James. These are two good people to know if you want to know anything about the historical Jesus. I wish I knew them. This is what Ehrman says, and he calls himself an agnostic atheist. So he knows the importance of this. Then Paul says that 14 years later, he returns to Jerusalem, and he says, this time I met with the pillars of the church, and he names them, Peter, James, and John. So it's a second time meeting with Peter and James, and now we bring in John, another one of Jesus' 3 closest disciples. And Paul says his reason for meeting with them is so he could run the gospel message. Now remember this, to run the gospel message past them, to ensure that he was preaching that they were preaching. And Paul says they added nothing to my message. They just said, continue to preach, feeding the poor, and you're good, Paul. Your own message, keep up the good work. Now, maybe Paul was lying about that. We can't assume that he was telling the truth. Maybe he was lying. Do we have any evidence that he was lying? No. Do we have evidence that he was telling the truth? Yes. Because some of the apostles may have had disciples of their own. It's believed, that Clement of Rome may very well have been a disciple of the apostle Peter. We have a letter written by Clement called First Clement. It did not make it into the New Testament, but it has survived. And then there's another guy named Polycarp, who is a good chance he was a disciple of the apostle John. And we have a letter that he wrote to the church at Philippi. Now, by the way, just as a fringe benefit, some of you're young, you're going to get married, you're going to have kids. If it's a boy, you're going to think names. So just remember some of these, like Polycarp, Okay? Now, if Clement of Rome and Polycarp were disciples of Peter and John respectively, then what they have to say about Paul is important. And they're both writing after Paul's death, and so they're not feeling threatened by Paul. They can just be honest. So it's really interesting to see that Clement of Rome refers to Paul as the blessed Paul, and he places Paul on par with his mentor Peter. And Polycarp says that Paul, and I quote, accurately and reliably taught the message of truth, and then he quotes from Ephesians and refers to it as part of the sacred scriptures. This is not the kind of stuff that you do if you think Paul was, and Peter and John were saying Paul was teaching heresy. It is precisely the kind of things you would say if Paul was teaching what Peter and John, the other apostles, were teaching, the very thing that Paul says Peter and John and James affirmed, that he was teaching the truth. So we have good reason to believe Paul on this. I could go on and give you some other reasons for this, but I'm limited in time. So, when Paul says he was preaching the gospel message, the same thing they were preaching, it's like we can believe him on that. That doesn't mean that it would be a hasty general conclusion to say that, therefore, Paul, everything he taught was what the Jerusalem apostles were teaching. He may have. We can't prove that, though. All Paul is saying in Galatians 2 is he's preaching the same gospel message they're preaching, which is the most important part of the message, though. Now, wouldn't it be great if archaeologists came across some lost letter of Paul? We do have some letters lost to Paul's. Like at the end of Colossians, Paul tells them to read the letter that he wrote to the church at Laodicea. What? We don't have that in the New Testament. It's been lost. In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about a letter that he previously wrote to them. So our 1 Corinthians is actually 2 Corinthians. What if, we're missing that letter? Wouldn't that be cool to get that? Wouldn't it be neat if we archaeologists found a lost letter of Paul and we open it and it's like, he says, hey, I heard that there are disputes among some of you who read my letter to the church at Rome and about predestination and election, and you guys are insulting one another, and so I want to set the record straight. Wouldn't that be cool to have something like that? So wouldn't it be neat if we found a lost letter of Paul in which he said, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you, and then he gave us an outline of it. Now that would be awesome, because now we would know what the gospel message was. Through that, we're getting back to the Jerusalem apostles. Because Paul had his gospel message affirmed by them, we can know that this is what the apostles were preaching. Well, we don't need a lost letter of Paul, because another one of his undisputed letters says exactly that. 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 1, he says, now I want to remind you, brethren, of the gospel message I preached to you. And now he's going to give us an outline of it. And he says this, I delivered to you what I also received. When did he deliver it? He's writing this letter around the year 55, within 25 years of Jesus' death. He said, I delivered to you, when? Around the year 51, when he established the First Baptist Church of Corinth. I delivered to you in 51 what I received beforehand. When did he receive it? Sometime before 51. Now, some scholars, like Robert Funk of the Jesus Seminar, Gerrit Ludemann, both atheist scholars, they said that Paul received this tradition from the apostles within 1 to 3 years of the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, you know what I say to that? It might be right. But I'm going to out-critic the critic here and say, I think they're jumping to a hasty conclusion. Because how do we know that this is when Paul received it? He could have received it at any time. Paul doesn't say when he received it. He doesn't even tell us who he received it from. We know he received it prior to 51. Maybe he received it at his conversion. Maybe he, when he went, in Damascus, maybe he received it then. Maybe he received it 3 years after his conversion. Maybe he received it when he goes up 14 years later. Maybe in the time in between when he's traveling with Barnabas or Silas, he received it from them at that time. We don't know when, but we know he received it prior to 50, and we know that he received it from a source that he deemed credible, and it must have been either an apostle or an associate of one of the apostles. And he had run his gospel message past them, and he had it affirmed by them. So it goes back to the apostles any way you want to look at it. It goes back to the alleged eyewitnesses in 20 years or less after the death of Jesus. That is early, and it's eyewitness testimony. Folks, this is the kind of stuff historians drool over. And we get it without even appealing to the Gospels. Now, what is it that the apostles were claiming? Here's what it says. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared. Now, notice it has a long, short structure. This is called parallelism. And it was one of the ways that they would set things up in order to make things easy to memorize in antiquity. So we know that this is oral tradition for a few reasons. Number one, he uses the terms delivered and received. Number two, you have parallelism. And number three, in verses 11, 12, and 14, he says, this is the gospel we preach to you. This is what you believe. And when he uses the term gospel, he uses the term kerugma, or we would say kerygma, meaning the official public proclamation. So this is the official, formal, public proclamation of what the apostles were preaching. It's an outline of it. Again, this is like really cool stuff. So he's talking about the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances of Jesus. And then he lists some of these appearances. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 at one time. Then Paul adds in parentheses here, you could say, most of these are still alive, although a few of them have died. And by that, Paul is suggesting that a lot of these people to whom Jesus appeared are still alive. You can ask them about it. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. And then Paul says, last of all, is to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Now, he's mentioning Peter and James here. Who do you think he got that information from? He met with them twice, right? So he knows this is from them, and he knows about the other apostles. He'd been up to Jerusalem. He'd met with people and traveled with some of them. So he knows about these, and of course he's claiming to be an eyewitness himself. There are 3 individual appearances. Paul knew the individuals. And then there are 3 group appearances. We'll get to the group appearances in a moment. Then Paul says, like I said, whether I or they, the other apostles, this is what we preached, kerygma, and this is what you believed. So, we also read that not only were they proclaiming that Jesus rose and appeared to them, we also see that they were willing to endure persecution. Now, a number of scholars will rightly point out that a lot of the evidence we have, the ancient sources that talk about the deaths of the apostles, is late. And some of it is quite embellished. Like we mentioned Polycarp. There's a document written in about the middle of the 2nd century that gives us a narrative of Polycarp's martyrdom. It's called the Martyrdom of Polycarp. And it's got some stuff that almost certainly is embellishments in there. It's like Polycarp is brought before the Roman governor. He's in a stadium. He won't deny Christ, and so he's condemned to be burned at the stake. And so he's at the stake, and they want to nail him to the stake. And he says, please don't nail me. My love for and commitment to Christ will keep me here. And the Roman says, oh, okay. Yeah, right. So Polycarp's there. He's not nailed. They light the fire all around him, and they say that the fire goes around him, and it won't consume him. The Christians see him in there protected, and there's a very nice aroma that comes out like the baking of bread. And then the Roman guard executioner, he wants to make sure that Polycarp dies, and so he stabs him with a spear, and when he pulls the spear out, so much blood comes out from Polycarp that it puts out the fire. So did Polycarp die as a martyr? Yes. Was the story amplified? Yes. And we find this not only in some Christian accounts, but we find it in some Jewish martyrdom accounts as well. Some of the ancient martyrdom accounts are late, they're embellished. We don't know if they're true, as they could be, but they may not be. So I say, let's just see what we have from the 1st century. Just from the 1st century, which are far more reliable. So you got Paul's letters in 1 Corinthians 15. He says that he and the other disciples are subjected to persecution for preaching the gospel, so much so that they are under threat of being killed every day. Doesn't mean they died for their faith, but it means they were continuing to preach Christ despite the daily threat of being killed, which shows that they truly believed what they were proclaiming. The Acts of the Apostles, written in the 1st century, that talks about the martyrdom of some of the, of Stephen, of James, the son of Zebedee, one of the apostles, and the persecution of the other apostles. The Gospel of John, chapter 21, Jesus and Peter are walking along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and he tells Peter, right now you can clothe yourself, you can go wherever you want to, you can do whatever you want to do, but the day is coming when someone will prevent you from doing what you want to do, and they will stretch out your hands. And John says, Jesus said this to signify the kind of death by which Paul would suffer. Now, if John is writing between 90 and 95, Paul was executed in the mid-60s. So he's actually reporting the death of Paul, which had happened about 30 years before. And then you've got Josephus. He mentions the martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus, 1st century. 1 Clement We're not sure when that was written. It was either written in the late 60s. I tend to think it's in the late 60s. There's a growing number of scholars who's putting it in the late 60s. Most today think it was sometime around the year 90 that it was written, but Clement mentions the persecution of the apostles, that they continuously endured it, and he mentions the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. And remember, Clement may have been a disciple of the apostle Peter. So we got some pretty good sources, 5 sources from the first century alone that talk about how the disciples were willing to suffer continuously and even die for their gospel proclamation. Now, that doesn't mean what they were proclaiming is true. I mean, we know that Muslims, many of them, the jihadists, are willing to die for their cause. We know that some Buddhists are for theirs. We know that some atheists are willing to die for atheism, as we found with communists, like the Korean War and Lenin and Marx. They're all willing to suffer and die for their ideologies. It doesn't mean those ideologies, their worldviews are correct, but it does mean they sincerely believe they are. Right? You don't have a Muslim go to Al-Qaeda and say, hey, what can I do? And they say, well, we want you to strap a bomb on your back and go out and blow up hundreds of people. And the person doesn't think, well, let's see. Muhammad was a false prophet. The Quran is not from God. And if I kill all these innocent people, God may send me to hell. Sign me up. No, they're saying, I believe in this. I'm willing to die for it. I'm willing to give my life for it, because I believe it's true. The same thing with Jesus' disciples. They were willing to suffer, they were willing to die because they believed Jesus actually rose and appeared to them. And I'd submit to you that's a little bit different than for us. Muslim jihadists die for what they believe is true, but for all they know, it may not be. We today as Christians are willing to endure persecution and death for what we believe is true, but for all we know, it may not be. The disciples were willing to suffer and die for what they believed is true, but they actually knew whether it was true. And liars make poor martyrs. The original disciples not only proclaimed Jesus rose from the dead, they actually believed it. It's not to say that he actually rose at this point, it is to say they believed it. What did they mean by resurrection? Did they mean it was a spiritual thing? Jesus only rose spiritually? What did they mean by it? Was it bodily? Well, here's what Paul says, 1 Corinthians. Again, all of my quoting Paul here is from his undisputed letters. Now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who sleep. Being asleep was a euphemism in antiquity. It was a nice way of saying you died. Like today, we say the person passed away rather than saying he croaked. Okay? So Christ is the first to be raised from the dead, been raised from the first fruits. He's the first to be raised from the dead. You say, well, wait a minute. Didn't Jesus raise some people from the dead, like Lazarus, Jairus' daughter, the widow's son? Yes. But in the context of 1 Corinthians 15, it's talking about being raised with a resurrection body, an immortal body. The people that Jesus raised, the people that Elijah and Elisha in the Old Testament raised, were raised with the same kind of body, only to die again. Resurrection bodies don't die again. They're immortal. And so what Paul is saying here is Jesus is the first to be raised with a resurrection body. Well, when are the rest of us going to be raised? Paul answers that 3 verses later. He says, now each in his own order, Christ the first fruits, then those who belong to Christ at his coming. When Jesus returns, the rest of us are going to be resurrected. Now, just put a little bookmark there, because now some of you are thinking, well, what happens to us now when we die? Okay? Well, here's just a little side thing. It's free to you all, okay? It's a bonus content. Paul elsewhere talks about, in 2 Corinthians 5:8, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Okay? Jesus said to the thief on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise. Paul in Philippians chapter 1 says that he had the option, you know, he's in prison. He says, I could die and be with Christ, for that's a whole lot better, yet to remain on in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. If it was soul sleep that you die and your soul sleeps until Christ returns, like the Jehovah's Witnesses believe, then the problem you have is, he says, I'd prefer to die and be with Christ, for that is very much better. Well, to soul sleep is not being with Christ. He believes he's going to be with Christ when he dies. Here's one more thing. 1 Thessalonians, probably the first letter Paul wrote. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, Paul says, I don't want you to grieve about those who are asleep, those who have died. I don't want you to grieve about it as non-believers do. He said, because he goes on to talk about when Christ returns, he's going to bring back with him those who have died as believers. He's going to bring us back with him. And then he says, the trumpet will sound and the dead in Christ will be raised. Well, wait a minute. If he's bringing them back with him, then what's being raised? Well, that's simple. What's happening is when we die, as Paul said, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. We die, our spirit goes to be with Christ in heaven. When he returns, he brings back our spirits. We will exist as a disembodied spirit in heaven. When he returns, he brings back our disembodied spirits with him. They are then put back into our corpses. And then those are resurrected and transformed into an immortal, glorious, powerful body. It's a bodily resurrection. That's what happens to us when we die. Okay, now let's go back to our thing. Also, Paul says in Romans 8:11, he said, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. He gave life to Jesus' mortal body. He will give life to our mortal bodies. And then a few verses later, in verse 23, when Christ returns, there will be the redemption of our bodies. Resurrection is a physical event that involves our corpse. That's what Paul says. This is part of his gospel. Interesting enough, isn't that entirely consistent with the bodily resurrection of Jesus? As Christ was raised, we will be raised. It will be a bodily, physical resurrection. That's what they meant by resurrection. The apostles meant for Jesus' resurrection to be understood as a historical event. It really happened, they were claiming. There are some scholars I've debated, like John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar, and he believes that the claim that Jesus was raised physically is theological yuck, he calls it. He says they wouldn't believe that a corpse was raised back from the dead. They just mean that Jesus' teachings still live on today. It means that, hey, when you come and worship with us, even though Jesus is dead, you can kind of sense his spirit because we all love one another. Come join us. That's such liberal nonsense, isn't it? It's like, is that what they meant? Well, let's see what they meant. Did they mean something like that? Was it a metaphor? Here's what Paul says, again in 1 Corinthians 15. He's talking about the dead being raised, and he says, look, us, when we die, do we just cease to exist? Or what happens? He says, if the dead are not raised, then Christ was not raised. And if Christ was not raised, your faith is worthless. You are still in your sins, then also those who have died in Christ have perished. If Christ was not raised, we're not going to be raised. If we're not going to be raised, this life is all there is. And so let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. My wife said to me a couple years ago, she said, in fact, she just said this to me again last week. She said, if Christianity turned out and it wasn't true, I'd still want to be a Christian because I think the ethics are still good. I said, well, yeah, the ethics are good, but if Christianity isn't true, now I'm going to go out and have some fun. I'm sorry. Paul himself said, let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. If the dead are not raised, this life is all there is. Get all the ice cream you want. Get all the sex you want. Take weed. Cheat on your test, your taxes, whatever. Do whatever you can get away with to make your life more pleasant and enjoyable, because this is it. That's what Paul is saying. So his general argument here is, if Christ has not been raised, we're not going to be raised. If we're not going to be raised, this life is all there is, and the Christian life is not worth living. But Christ was raised. Therefore, we will be raised. Therefore, the Christian life is worth living. And that argument makes no sense unless Paul and the apostles meant to communicate that Jesus actually rose from the dead. It was a real event. It's not just some pie in the sky thing. Oh, come and worship with us. We love one another, and you can sense Jesus' presence. They really meant it, and they were willing to lay down their lives for it. So let's summarize. 6 facts. Jesus died by crucifixion. This is all part of historical bedrock. A number of his disciples had experiences they interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to them. They truly believed it. We also see the risen Jesus is said to have appeared to groups. They claimed it. Paul had an experience he interpreted as an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. The apostles believed Jesus was raised bodily, physically, and the apostles believe the resurrection of Jesus is historical. These 6 facts are granted by virtually every scholar out there who studies the subject, no matter how skeptical. Now, what do we do with these facts? This is where it becomes simple, a lot simpler. I'm just going to get into one thing here, and that is what we might call explanatory scope with the method. It's like putting together pieces of the puzzle. We got a lot of tools, but if we're putting together pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, we've got to include the maximum number of pieces, and they've got to fit well. If they leave the pieces of the puzzle orphaned, we know there's something wrong with that solution. So let's just look at the resurrection hypothesis. Does it account for the death of Jesus? Sure. Does it account for, if Jesus rose from the dead, does it account for why the disciples had experiences they interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to them? Absolutely. Does it account for the claims of groups that Jesus had appeared to them? Yep. Does it account for the enemy of the church, the persecutor of the church, Paul, of him having some experience that he believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus? Sure. Does it account for why they believed Jesus was raised physically from the dead? Yep. Does it account for why they believed that it was a real event that happened in history? Absolutely. My point here is that if we take only those 6 facts about the resurrection that virtually every scholar agrees on, so you can't say, well, you're biased, that's why. Nope. Almost every scholar, atheist, agnostic, Jewish, liberal, conservative, moderates, they all agree on these 6 facts. The resurrection hypothesis easily accounts, very comfortably accounts for every one of these 6 facts. Now, I can't go through every hypothesis that is out there today. Let me just take the most popular one that is offered by skeptical scholars today, and that's the hallucination hypothesis. So that's to say that we can anticipate that Jesus' disciples would have been grief-stricken, and so therefore it would make sense. It's plausible that they would have experienced hallucinations of the risen Jesus. Let's talk just for a moment about what a hallucination is. A hallucination is a false sensory perception. You believe that you are perceiving something with your natural senses that isn't really there. You can have a visual hallucination, an auditory hallucination, what's called an olfactory hallucination, where you have a sense that you're smelling something, but that's not there. A gustatory hallucination, one of taste. A kinesthetic hallucination, a sense of motion. How many of us, all of us, have had a dream at some time during our lifetime where we have the sense we're falling, and then we wake up? That is called a kinesthetic hallucination. We had a sense of motion. A tactile hallucination is where you have a sense of feel, of touch. When probably all of us in here, or most of us, when we got our mobile phones for the very first time, and we put it on silent or vibrate when we went into a meeting. Brand new phone, our first time mobile phone, it's in our pocket or whatever, and we had a sense. We either thought we heard it or felt it go off, that we got a text message, and we pulled it out and we nobody loves me. That is called a tactile hallucination. So it doesn't mean that you have to have a mental health issue in order to experience a hallucination. We all do at times. Well, the multiple studies done over more than a century period suggest that the person most likely to experience a hallucination are those grieving over the loss of a loved one. And approximately 7% of them experience a visual hallucination. Only 7%. 50% experience a hallucination of some sort, but only 7% experience a visual hallucination. Why is that important? Because they said Jesus appeared to them. Not that they heard him, he appeared to them. It's a visual experience. By the way, the Gospels report that Jesus, and I'm appealing to the Gospels now, I don't need it for my case. I just want to give you a little note here. They talk about how they could touch Jesus, they could see him, and they could hear him, and he taught them. Well, hallucinations almost always occur in a single mode. You'll see something, but you don't hear it as well. It's a single mode. Schizophrenics and people high on drugs will experience hallucinations in multiple modes, but outside of that, it's always in a single mode. So, but again, you could throw out the Gospels. I don't need that part. I just wanted to throw that in there. If the Gospels are correct, and I think they are, then it couldn't have been a hallucination because it was in multiple modes. That is, unless they were high on drugs. And, well, in that case, maybe there was another reason they referred to Jesus as the Most High God. Now, hallucinations, because they are private occurrences in the mind of an individual, they have no external reality. So I couldn't wake up my wife. They're like dreams. I couldn't wake her up in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a dream. I'm in Maui. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream. Let's have a free vacation. You can't do that. Because she might go back to sleep, dream she's in Maui. I go back, I dream I'm in Maui, but we're not having the same dream. Okay. It's kind of like this. I don't know how many people, several hundred in this room right now. Let's just say that all of us took a sleeping pill, and I said, when we go to sleep, let's all dream we're in Maui. How many of us do you think would dream we're in Maui? All of us? No, not all of us. And would we would the contents of our dreams, those of us who dreamt we're in Maui, would the contents be so similar that we all believed we had the same dream? No. So group hallucinations it's a difficult pill to swallow because just like dreams, there is no external reality. So you can't participate in a group hallucination. You might most people be having a hallucination simultaneously, which is unlikely, but it does happen on occasion, but they're not having the same kind of hallucinations. When it comes to the hallucination hypothesis, does it account for the death of Jesus? What do you think? Yeah, because the death of Jesus would have caused them to experience grief, which would have put them in the frame of mind for a hallucination. Does it account for the appearances to the disciples, their belief that Jesus had risen and appeared to them? No. Well, why not? Because we're talking about 100% of them believed that Jesus rose and appeared to them. Whereas the statistics and research shows that only 7% have visual hallucinations who are grieving the loss of a loved one. What about the group appearances? No, because as we just described, group hallucinations are probably impossible, but at the very best, they are extremely rare. And now we're saying that at least 3 of them, he appeared to the 12, to more than 500, to all of the apostles. So something that is extremely rare, if not impossible, what's the probabilities of it occurring 3 times? Excuse me. To Paul, doesn't explain him. Paul wasn't grieving over Jesus' death. He was glad Jesus was dead. He believed Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet. So Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. Hallucinations don't lead to the belief that a person had been raised physically from the dead. My dad had a visual hallucination of my mom. Several months after my mom died, my dad was sleeping and he woke up and he thought he saw my mom sitting in a chair, but it was like her illuminated spirit. Nobody thinks that when they experience a hallucination of a loved one, that if they went to the person's grave, it would be empty. All right? They don't think it's a bodily resurrection. Spiritual, yes, but it doesn't lead to the belief that the person had been raised bodily, physically. Would hallucinations account for their belief that the resurrection is a historical event? Yes, it does. So you can see that when you compare the hallucination hypothesis, the most popular natural alternative offered to the resurrection hypothesis, and you just look at it and you try to do a sober-minded comparison on which one can explain the historical bedrock. The resurrection hypothesis comes out on top by a large margin. The number one alternative is not even close in its ability to explain the wide consensus who have accepted these as facts. And so at the end of the day, the resurrection hypothesis is the best explanation of the widely agreed on facts. In fact, it's not only the best explanation, it is by far the best historical explanation of the facts. And folks, this is encouraging to me because it's like what I have believed the Holy Spirit originally revealed to me, that Christianity is true. It's like it's confirmed by a very careful, sober-minded, scientific approach to the data. It points very strongly to the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. And practically speaking, it's got some great applications. You know, the way Western society is going, we may be experiencing some real persecution as believers in the future. I don't know how soon it will be, but I think it's coming. And as George has said, I like the way he put it, we are no longer the home team. We are the visiting team, and we are in a hostile stadium. It's like J. Gresham Machen, who was one of the last conservative professors at Princeton, 100 and some years ago. He said that we can preach with all the fervor of a reformer and succeed in only winning a straggler here and there if we permit the collective thought of our culture to regard Christianity as nothing more than a harmless delusion. We arrived at that point many decades ago. We've gone further. We're not regarded as a harmless delusion. We are regarded as a harmful delusion now. And I think persecution may be coming in the years. It might be a decade, 2, 3 decades from now. I think our grandchildren are going to see some real persecution for sure, unless some things really change. When that persecution comes, and we are faced with either standing up for our faith or going to prison, I'm glad we got some really good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Because it's not just a leap in the dark, a leap of faith. It's a leap into light. It's a reasonable step into the light. When we are faced with difficult questions, the resurrection of Jesus is important. When we get bad news, look, I'm 61. I know my day is coming when I'm going to get bad news. If I don't drop out of the sky in a plane and die or get in a car accident, the day is going to come when I get bad news from a physician that I've got cancer and I'm going to die, or heart disease, I'm going to die. It's coming. It's going to happen to all of us. It's either going to be murder or an accident or disease that's going to get every one of our loved ones and us. And so it's coming. And when we are faced with death, or get that bad news, the resurrection of Jesus informs us of what comes next. And it's like, man, it's all gravy after life. It's all gravy. It's all good. And it's like if I was working in a miserable job and I won the lottery and the check was coming in 2 weeks and I put in my 2-week notice. It's like I could stand on my head for 2 weeks. I could endure whatever at my job for 2 weeks because I know in 2 weeks it's gravy. And it's like, you know, life is tough. We have physical pain from ruptured discs or whatever, heart, diabetes, all kinds of nasty stuff that happens to our bodies, skin diseases. all that. Our loved ones are impacted in negative ways. There's mental illness. Life is a challenge. Life sucks at times, doesn't it? A lot of times. All right? And we have trials and suffering that are peppered in between good times in life. There's no way to escape it. And it's nice to know that what life is, if the scriptures are correct, it's a proving ground. It is a time for us, for God to develop holiness in us and prepare us for an eternity of just a wonderful eternity. Not a wonderful attorney. There are no wonderful attorneys. So until you need one. So what I love about the resurrection here is it tells me that God cares about me, he cares about you, and he loves you. He loves all of us. He wants the best for us. And that means conforming us to the image of his son, and he's got a wonderful eternity ahead of us. And so let's go out. Let's share our faith with others. Let's be encouraged. Let's kick butt and take names for Jesus. I hope this is encouraging to you.